The transport ship USS General Mitchell cut through gray Atlantic waters. Below deck, 32 young women sat in rigid silence. Their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms were stained with sweat and sea spray. All believed they were sailing toward their deaths. Helena Schneider pressed her back against the cold metal wall, hands trembling. At 23, she had served as a radio operator in Munich until American tanks captured her position. That had been 17 days ago. 17 days of uncertainty and searching the faces of her captors for the cruelty she had been trained to expect. Across from Helena, 19-year-old Ruth Weber cried quietly. She had been a typist at a supply depot near Stuttgart, the daughter of a baker who had volunteered for auxiliary service. Now she wished she had never left home. Erika Fisher was not crying. Her jaw was set, her blue eyes hard as winter ice. At 25, she had been a true believer. She would endure whatever came, would resist with her last breath, would prove herself worthy of the cause. The indoctrination session haunted Helena. She remembered the Gestapo officer describing what awaited captured women. The Americans were savage and without honor. They would torture prisoners for information, violate women without mercy, execute anyone who resisted. Death would be a blessing compared to what the Americans would inflict. Helena had believed every word. The officer had shown them photographs, documents, testimonies from prisoners who had supposedly escaped American camps. Now, listening to the ship's engines, Helena thought of her mother in Berlin, probably dead under Allied bombs. She thought of her younger brother, last seen in a Hitler Youth uniform, marching toward the Eastern Front. Her family was gone. Perhaps she would follow them into darkness. An American sailor appeared at the hatch. Several women flinched. He gestured upward. Time to disembark. The moment they had been dreading had arrived. The camp sprawled across a former Army training ground in rural Virginia. As the prisoners were unloaded from transport trucks, Helena studied the compound with mounting dread. Guard towers stood at each corner. Barracks buildings stretched in neat rows. Everything was orderly, efficient, ominous. This was where they would die. Helena was certain. The propaganda had been clear. American camps were facades, designed to lull prisoners into false security before the real horror began. The women were lined up. American soldiers stood nearby, rifles slung casually. Helena noticed none of them were aiming at the prisoners. This small detail confused her. Ruth collapsed. The journey, the fear, the lack of proper food, it all caught up with her at once. Helena tensed, waiting for violence. Surely they would beat Ruth for showing weakness. That was what the Gestapo officer had described. Instead, 2 American soldiers rushed forward. They knelt beside Ruth, movements quick but gentle. One cradled her head, the other called for water. Within seconds, they were helping Ruth drink, speaking in low, reassuring tones she couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. You're safe. Helena felt something crack inside her chest. This wasn't how enemies behaved. This wasn't the brutality she had been promised. Erika's voice cut through the confusion. It's a trick. Don't fall for their performance. But even Erika's certainty wavered as Ruth was helped to her feet, as the soldiers continued supporting her with care that seemed too genuine to be theater. The camp commander emerged, a colonel with gray hair and tired eyes. Through an interpreter, Corporal Schmidt, he addressed them. You are now under the protection of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. The words seemed impossible. Protection? The Geneva Convention? These were concepts Helena had heard before, but always with mockery. International law was fiction, the propaganda had insisted. A weak tool that meant nothing. Yet here stood an American colonel, speaking these words as if treating prisoners with basic human dignity was the most natural thing in the world. The processing station was a converted warehouse with examination tables separated by canvas screens. Dr. Margaret Hayes stood near the entrance, reviewing medical forms. She was 42, a physician from Boston who had volunteered for military service. She had treated soldiers with horrific wounds, had worked 18-hour shifts in field hospitals. Something about these young women affected her differently. Perhaps it was seeing them in their stained uniforms, trying to maintain dignity despite obvious terror. These women were the enemy, yes, but they were also just girls caught in the machinery of war. Dr. Hayes approached them, speaking slowly through Corporal Schmidt. I need to examine each of you to assess your health. This is not an interrogation. I'm checking for injuries, malnutrition, or illness. Everything will be conducted with respect. The prisoners stared with incomprehension that went deeper than the language barrier. Helena wondered if this was the prelude to torture. Helena was called first. She followed Dr. Hayes behind a screen, heart hammering. The doctor gestured for her to sit on the examination table. Dr. Hayes began with basic vital signs: blood pressure, pulse, temperature. Her hands were steady and impersonal. She checked Helena's eyes, her throat, listened to her lungs. When she discovered the infected cut on Helena's left arm, the doctor's expression shifted to concern. Through Schmidt, Dr. Hayes explained that the wound needed cleaning and antibiotics. She asked if it hurt. She asked when Helena had last eaten properly. She asked as if Helena's comfort mattered. When Dr. Hayes began cleaning the wound, Helena braced herself for deliberate pain. Instead, the doctor worked with a gentleness that made Helena's vision blur with tears. Each motion was careful. When Helena winced, Dr. Hayes paused, gave her a moment, then continued with even greater delicacy. There, Dr. Hayes said, when she finished bandaging. Through Schmidt. That should heal nicely. Come back in 3 days so I can check it. If it starts hurting worse or you develop a fever, tell one of the guards immediately. Helena nodded, unable to speak. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. Where was the cruelty? As Helena stood to leave, Dr. Hayes met her eyes directly and said, in careful German, Sie sind ein Mensch, kein Feind. You are a human being, not an enemy. The crack in Helena's certainty widened into a fissure. The mess hall was a large wooden structure that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Long tables were arranged in rows, already set with metal trays and utensils. Helena and the other prisoners filed in hesitantly, certain this was another test whose rules they didn't understand. Behind a serving counter, 3 American cooks were ladling food onto plates. Real food. Helena could see beef stew, potatoes, carrots, green beans, thick slices of white bread. The portions were not generous by peacetime standards, but compared to the scraps they had survived on during the final months of the war, this might as well have been a feast. Helena took her tray, staring at it in disbelief. This had to be staged, a temporary show before the real deprivation began. No army fed its prisoners this well. It was wasteful, illogical. Prisoners were supposed to receive barely enough to survive, to be kept weak and compliant. The women sat together at one table, none of them touching their food. They watched the American guards eating their own meals at nearby tables, checking to see if the soldiers' portions were different. They appeared to be the same. The guards were eating the same stew, the same bread, from identical trays. Ruth picked up her spoon with a shaking hand. She scooped a small amount of stew, brought it halfway to her mouth, then stopped. Her face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks again. I don't understand, she whispered in German. Why are they doing this? It's manipulation, Erika hissed. They're softening us before interrogation, making us grateful so we'll betray information. But even as Erika spoke, Helena saw her eyes linger on the food, saw the hunger she couldn't quite suppress. How long had it been since any of them had eaten properly? The final weeks of the war had been chaos. Food supplies had collapsed. They had subsisted on whatever could be scavenged. One of the American guards noticed their hesitation. He was young, perhaps 21, with the kind of open, friendly face that made him seem like someone's younger brother. He walked over to their table, and several women flinched. Through Corporal Schmidt, who seemed to be everywhere, translating constantly, the guard said, "It's okay. The food is safe. You can eat. Nobody's going to hurt you." Then he did something unexpected. He sat down at their table, picked up his own spoon, and took a bite of stew from his tray. He smiled at them, chewing, demonstrating. See? It's fine. It's just food. Helena found herself taking a bite. The flavors exploded across her tongue, rich and savory and warm. She had forgotten what properly seasoned food tasted like. Her body responded immediately, hunger roaring to life after being suppressed for so long. She took another bite, then another. Around the table, other women began eating. Some cried while they ate. Some ate with mechanical desperation, unable to process the contradiction between what they had been told and what they were experiencing. Only Erika held out, her tray untouched, her expression a mask of righteous suspicion. The guard who had sat with them started talking through Schmidt. His name was Private James Morrison, he said. He was from a small town in Ohio. His mother had been born in Germany, had immigrated to America when she was 16. The war had scattered his family across continents. He had cousins he'd never met, might never meet now, depending on what borders looked like when the fighting finally stopped. My mom, Morrison continued, his voice soft with memory. She used to tell me stories about her village, about festivals and neighbors helping each other during harvests. She said people were just people everywhere, good ones and bad ones and mostly ones in between, trying their best. He looked at the women, his expression earnest. I know you've been told things about us. We've been told things about you too. But right now, here, we're all just trying to get through this. You're not monsters. We're not monsters. We're just people caught up in something bigger than any of us. Helena set down her spoon, no longer hungry despite the half-full tray. Morrison's words were worse than cruelty would have been. They were undermining everything, creating doubt where certainty had once resided. If Americans could see them as human, if Americans had mothers who remembered Germany with fondness, if this young soldier could sit at their table and speak about shared humanity, then what did that mean about everything Helena had believed? The women's barracks was clean. This simple fact was perhaps the most disorienting detail of all. Helena had expected filth, overcrowding, deliberate discomfort designed to break their spirits. Instead, they were led into a long building with rows of iron frame beds, each with a mattress, pillow, and 2 blankets. The floor had been swept, the windows, though barred, were intact and allowed fresh air to circulate. A female American sergeant named Patricia Caldwell was waiting inside. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. Through Schmidt, she explained the barracks routine. Lights out at 10, wake up at 6, 3 meals daily, access to washing facilities, a small library of books in German that prisoners could borrow. A library. Helena almost laughed at the absurdity. They were prisoners of war, yet they could read books? Sergeant Caldwell continued. You are permitted to walk within the designated prisoner areas during daylight hours. There are recreational facilities, including a small sports field. Letter writing materials will be provided for correspondence with family members, though all letters will be censored for security purposes. You may keep personal items that do not pose security risks. Erika exploded. The German words came rapid fire, her voice shrill with outrage. What kind of game is this? Do you think we're stupid? Do you think we'll believe this obvious charade? Just get it over with. Stop pretending. Show us what you really are. Sergeant Caldwell waited patiently for the translation, her expression unchanged. When Erika finished, Caldwell responded calmly. This is not a game. These are the conditions under which you will be held. If you have complaints about the treatment you receive, there is a formal process for filing grievances. If you violate camp regulations, there are consequences. But there will be no torture, no executions, no abuse. That is not how we operate. Erika stared at her, breathing hard, searching for deception in Caldwell's steady gaze. When she found nothing, her anger collapsed into something that looked almost like despair. Without the cruelty she had been promised, Erika had no framework for understanding her situation. The worldview she had constructed so carefully was being dismantled, and she had nothing with which to replace it. That night, lying on a real mattress for the first time in weeks, Helena stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of women crying, whispering, praying in the darkness. Outside, she could hear American guards making their rounds, their footsteps regular and unhurried. No screams pierced the night, no violence erupted. The camp was quiet. Helena thought about the Gestapo officer who had prepared them for capture. She tried to remember his exact words, the specific predictions he had made. Every single one had been wrong. They had not been beaten. They had not been starved. They had not been executed. They had been fed, examined by a doctor, given beds and blankets and told they could read books, which meant the officer had lied. Not mistaken, not misinformed, but deliberately lied to make them more afraid, more willing to die rather than surrender, more committed to fighting even when defeat was inevitable. If he had lied about American camps, what else had been lies? The second day brought more routine. Breakfast. A work detail, voluntary, helping in the camp laundry for a small payment in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen. Lunch. Free time in the afternoon. The mundane regularity was its own form of psychological disruption. Helena was assigned to fold linens alongside a woman named Anna Hartman, who had arrived at the camp 2 months earlier. Anna was from Hamburg, had worked in a munitions factory until it was bombed into rubble. She had a sardonic laugh and eyes that had seen too much. "You're still in shock," Anna observed, watching Helena's mechanical folding. "I remember. The first week is the hardest. Your brain keeps waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the real punishment to start. Took me 3 weeks to accept this was actually how they ran things." "But why?" Helena asked. "It doesn't make sense. We're the enemy. Have you talked to any of the male prisoners yet?" Anna's expression turned grim. "There's a men's section on the other side of camp. Some of them were captured on the Eastern Front first, ended up in Soviet camps before being transferred west. Ask them about enemy treatment. Ask them about the difference." That afternoon, during the recreation hour, Helena found herself near the fence that separated the women's section from the men's. A gaunt man with hollow eyes was standing on the other side, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. His name was Friedrich Bauer. He had been a sergeant in an infantry division decimated near Stalingrad. Helena asked him about Soviet captivity. She almost immediately regretted the question. Friedrich's description was methodical, devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting facts about someone else's life. The starvation rations that killed men slowly, the forced labor in conditions that killed them quickly, the casual brutality, the summary executions. He had survived 8 months in a Soviet POW camp before a prisoner exchange brought him west. He had watched stronger men than himself die from cold, from hunger, from beatings, from despair. "When the Americans took custody of our transport," Friedrich said, "I thought they were bringing us somewhere private to shoot us. That's what would have made sense. Why waste resources on enemy prisoners? But they brought us here instead. Fed us, got us medical care, treated us like we were actual human beings instead of vermin." He laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "The man who tortured me in the Soviet camp was following the same ideology I had been fighting for. The men who showed me mercy were the ones we called subhuman degenerates." Helena walked away from that conversation feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had become uncertain. She found Erika sitting alone on a bench, staring at nothing. "They lied to us," Helena said quietly. Erika didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I know." Those 2 words contained the weight of a shattered faith. Erika had believed so completely. She had organized her entire identity around the certainty of her cause's righteousness. To admit the lies meant admitting she had wasted years of her life, had hurt people, had supported atrocities, all in service of a fiction. "What do we do now?" Helena asked. Erika looked at her with eyes that had aged decades in a single day. "I don't know. Roll call happened twice daily, at morning and evening. The prisoners assembled in neat rows while an officer checked names against a roster. The process was efficient and respectful. No one shouted. No one struck prisoners who moved too slowly. The guards simply counted, verified, and dismissed them. On this evening, Helena stood in formation and realized she was not afraid. The fear that had been her constant companion since capture had faded into something else, a numbness perhaps, or maybe the beginning of acceptance. She was not going to die today. She was probably not going to die tomorrow. The Americans had no intention of killing her. When roll call concluded, Helena did not immediately return to the barracks. Instead, she walked to the far edge of the permitted area and looked up at the sky. It was deepening toward twilight, clouds catching the last pink rays of sunset. Birds were settling into trees beyond the fence, their evening songs a gentle chorus. For the first time in years, Helena allowed herself to simply exist in a moment without fear. She was not running from bombs. She was not terrified of torture. She was not bracing for execution. She was just standing in the evening air, breathing freely, watching the sky change colors. It felt like a betrayal. How could she permit herself this peace when her country had been destroyed, when her family was lost, when everything she had known was ashes? Yet the peace persisted, stubborn and unwelcome, refusing to be denied. Ruth joined her at the fence. The younger woman had stopped crying, had started eating regular meals, had begun to regain some color in her cheeks. "Do you think the war will end soon?" Ruth asked. "It's already over," Helena replied. "We just haven't admitted it yet." They stood together in comfortable silence, two young women who had nothing and everything in common, watching darkness settle over a prisoner of war camp that had shattered every expectation they had brought through its gates. Private Morrison drew night watch duty near the women's barracks. Quiet work, walking a prescribed route, checking locks. The prisoners were not attempting escape. Why would they? He saw Helena through the barracks window, writing in a notebook while other women slept. Morrison wondered what she was writing. A letter home, perhaps. A diary, trying to make sense of everything. Morrison thought about his mother's stories of Germany, the village that probably no longer existed. She had told him about neighbors sharing bread despite their arguments, about festivals where everyone danced regardless of status, about the fundamental sameness of people everywhere. His mother had wept when America entered the war, watching her adopted country fight her homeland. Morrison had joined the army partly to prove his loyalty. Now here he was, guarding German prisoners who looked like girls his mother might have known. The colonel had emphasized, these women were not hardened soldiers. Most were auxiliaries swept into the war machine through social pressure or limited options. They deserved the same treatment any prisoner deserved, under international law. Morrison saw Helena close her notebook, tuck it under her pillow, and lie down. Even from this distance, he could tell she was not sleeping, just staring at the ceiling. Helena's notebook entry from that night would survive the war, would eventually find its way into an archive at the Library of Congress, would be studied by historians trying to understand the psychological impact of captivity on German prisoners. The words were simple, direct, devastating in their honesty. Day 1. I am alive. They fed us. They treated our wounds. They gave us beds. Everything we were told was a lie. I do not know how to process this. I do not know who I am anymore if everything I believed was false. Tonight I felt safe. This terrifies me more than any threat could. Because if I was wrong about this, what else was I wrong about? What did I support? What did I become? I do not have answers. I only know that I am here, in this camp, and no one has hurt me. This is the first true thing I have experienced in longer than I can remember. Erika's entry, found in the same archive, was shorter and more anguished. They are supposed to be monsters. I was ready for monsters. I knew how to face monsters. But they are just people. How do I fight people? How do I hate people? Everything I believed has turned to dust. I have nothing left but questions and shame. Ruth did not keep a diary, but years later, in an interview with a historian, she would describe that first day with words that echoed Helena's. It was like waking up from a nightmare only to discover the nightmare was what I had been living before I was captured. The camp was not the horror. The camp was where I learned what horror I had been part of creating. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through barracks windows. Helena woke to the sound of women moving about, preparing for another day. She dressed slowly, her muscles sore from tension that was only now beginning to ease. In the washroom, she splashed cold water on her face and looked at her reflection in the small mirror. She looked the same as she had yesterday. But she was not the same person who had boarded that transport ship believing she was sailing toward her execution. That person had died sometime during the previous 24 hours, replaced by someone who no longer knew what to believe. At breakfast, the same food appeared. Oatmeal, bread, coffee. Helena ate without fear this time, her appetite returning as her body recognized it would be fed regularly. Around the mess hall, other prisoners were beginning to relax as well, their postures less rigid, their expressions less haunted. Dr. Hayes came through during the meal, checking on patients she had treated the day before. She stopped at Helena's table, examined the bandaged arm with professional efficiency, declared the wound was healing well, and moved on. The entire interaction took perhaps 90 seconds, but Helena felt the care embedded in it, the basic decency of a doctor following up with her patient, regardless of that patient's nationality. After breakfast, Sergeant Caldwell assembled the new prisoners for an orientation session. She explained work details, recreation schedules, the process for requesting religious services, how to use the canteen. It was all absurdly normal, a bureaucratic presentation that could have been given at any institution anywhere. "You will be here until the war ends and repatriation can be arranged," Caldwell explained. "We do not know how long that will be. It could be weeks, it could be months. During that time, you are expected to follow camp regulations, but you will not be forced to do anything that violates the Geneva Convention. You have rights as prisoners of war, and those rights will be respected." Helena listened to these words and felt the last fragments of her old worldview crumble. Rights, the Geneva Convention, respect. These concepts were not propaganda, they were not tricks. They were simply how these people operated, the baseline standard they applied even to enemies, which meant Germany had been the aberration. Germany had been the outlier. Germany had abandoned these principles and convinced its people that doing so was necessary, noble, right. The weight of this realization was crushing. Helena thought of all the propaganda she had consumed, all the hatred she had felt toward abstract enemies, all the assumptions she had made about racial and national superiority. None of it had been true. None of it had been remotely close to truth. That afternoon, Helena found Erika sitting in the recreation yard, watching other prisoners attempt to play volleyball with limited equipment and even more limited enthusiasm. Helena sat beside her, and for a long time neither woman spoke. Finally, Erika said, "My father was a party member from the beginning, 1933. He believed every word. He raised me to believe every word. When I was 14, I reported a neighbor for listening to BBC broadcasts. The Gestapo arrested him. I never saw him again. I was proud of what I had done." Erika's voice cracked. "I was proud. I destroyed a man's life, and I was proud." Helena had no comfort to offer. She had her own catalog of shame, her own memories of times she had remained silent when she should have spoken, had accepted lies when she should have questioned, had chosen comfort over conscience. "We were children," Helena said, eventually. "They caught us when we were children and taught us to hate before we learned to think." "Does that excuse it?" Erika asked. "No," Helena admitted, "but maybe it explains it." They sat in silence as the sun tracked across the sky, two young women facing the wreckage of their certainties, trying to imagine what came after the collapse of everything they had known. The war in Europe would end within weeks. Helena, Erika, Ruth, and the others would remain prisoners for another 8 months while the Allies worked through repatriating millions of displaced persons. When they finally returned to Germany, they would find a country that barely resembled the one they had left. Cities were ruins. Families were scattered. The full scope of the death camps would emerge in trials and testimonies that made their own awakening seem almost trivial by comparison. Helena would become a school teacher in Munich, dedicating her life to ensuring German children learned real history. She would speak to her students about that first day in the American camp, about the power of lies and the importance of questioning authority. Erika would struggle far longer, but slowly, painfully. She would rebuild herself around a different truth, that recognizing you were wrong was the first step toward becoming better. She would work with war victims' organizations, dedicating herself to reconciliation and remembrance. Ruth would emigrate to America, would marry a man whose grandfather had come from Bavaria, would raise children who knew both countries as home. She would never forget that first day, the terror that had preceded it, the kindness that had shattered her expectations. But on that first evening, as lights dimmed and women settled into bunks, none of them knew what the future held. They only knew that everything had changed. The propaganda had been exposed. The enemies had proven to be human. The world was not what they had been told. Helena lay in her bunk, listening to the quiet breathing around her, to the footsteps of guards, to the night sounds of peace. She thought about Dr. Hay's words, "You are a human being, not an enemy." She thought about Private Morrison sharing the story of his German mother. She thought about the food, the medical care, the basic dignity extended even to prisoners, and slowly, Helena allowed herself to believe that she might survive this. Not just physically, but as a person, that she might emerge with something worth rebuilding. It was a fragile hope, as uncertain as everything else, but it was real. And on that first day in the American camp, reality had proven to be surprisingly, impossibly kind. That truth would haunt and heal her, that kindness, even to enemies, was possible, that humanity could survive even the worst horrors, that treating prisoners with basic decency could shatter years of lies. One day, that was all it took to begin unraveling everything she had been taught. And in that first night's darkness, Helena finally slept without fear, knowing tomorrow would not bring torture, but simply another day of learning to see the world as it actually was. The propaganda had promised monsters. Reality had delivered human beings. And that made all the difference.